Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Frist Center for the Visual Arts. Thank you for being here tonight. I'm Ann Henderson, Director of Education and Outreach here. And on behalf of the Frist Center, I would like to thank the Metro Nashville Arts Commission, the Tennessee Arts Commission, and the National Endowment for their continued and ongoing support of our exhibitions and programs. I'd also like to thank our Looking East exhibition sponsors, HCA TriStar Healthcare, Christie's, and United States Japan Foundation. Tonight, we are very pleased to welcome Simon Kelly to the Frist Center for his lecture, Vincent van Gogh in Japan, that will explore the artist's fascination with Japan and the profound influence of Japanisme on his work. I invite you to visit the exhibition following the lecture to see Van Gogh's portrait of the postman, Joseph Rouland, one more time before the exhibition leaves on Sunday. Our galleries will remain open tonight until 9 o'clock. Simon Kelly has been the curator of modern and contemporary art at the St. Louis Art Museum since September of 2010. He's worked previously at such museums as the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Walters Art Museum in Baltimore, and the Nelson Atkins Museum of Art in Kansas City. He received his BA from the University of Cambridge and his PhD from Oxford University, where he also taught art history. Dr. Kelly has organized numerous exhibitions, including Monet's Water Lilies in 2011, for which he wrote the accompanying exhibition catalog. He's also published extensively on 19th and early 20th century French art and has been published in various exhibition catalogs for museums such as the National Gallery of London, as well as the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C., for such exhibitions also as Manet, the Man Who Invented Modern Art, and Becoming Van Gogh, which was published in 2012. But his essay, which was A Big Good Enterprise, Van Gogh and His Markets, received an award from the American Art Museum curators for his essay. Simon is currently curating the exhibition Impressionist France, Visions of Nation, from Legray to Monet, for which the St. Louis Art Museum organized it with the Nelson Atkins Museum of Art in Kansas City and the accompanying catalog. He's also currently working on Degas and Millinery for an upcoming exhibition as well. So please join me in giving him a warm welcome.
Light doesn't seem to be working, but anyway, it's great to be here, and thank you, Anne, for the introduction, and thank you for inviting me. So I've been impressed by the exhibition today. I've had a chance to see the show. Trinita has done a great job, and it's great to see the the mix of media that have been brought together in this exhibition. I wonder if we can get this light actually to. Yeah, I don't know. It should be good to. Oh, yeah, that's better. Well, actually, one minute, come on.
Oops.
It's all right. I mean, it's better now. So.
I'll give you a flashlight.
It's all right. So I'm going to start with a painting that I think really embodies Van Gogh's attraction to Japan. This painting, Self-Portrait as Bonzo, was painted in September 1888, when Van Gogh was in Arles, when he recently shaved his head to emulate the appearance of a Japanese Buddhist monk, or bonze. In a letter to Gogh at this time, he described himself as, quote, simply worshipping the eternal Buddha in this portrait. While to his sister, Will, he wrote that he represented himself as, quote, a Japanese. You might also gather that in a way Van Gogh has almost kind of adapted his features to look more Japanese if you look at the way he's represented himself here. But I think it's a good introduction to a talk which will examine Van Gogh's close identification with Japan for much of his life. Now, Van Gogh never went to Japan, but as we shall see, he read extensively about the art of Japan and the culture of the country, and he also built up an extensive collection of Japanese prints. it was interesting to read Trinita's introduction about Monet, so we can sort of go back and forth about who had more Japanese prints, Monet or Van Gogh, but certainly Van Gogh had a substantial collection. And Van Gogh's embrace of Japan is a central element within his broader career. And just a little context on Van Gogh here. He's perhaps best known as a kind of mythologized figure, the kind of archetypal, tormented and neglected artist who ultimately committed suicide at the age of only 37. He's generally thought to have committed suicide, despite the recent book that suggests that he was shot by a group of young boys in Auvers. But the Van Gogh Museum is sort of fiercely staying to the story that he did commit suicide. This kind of image of Van Gogh as a misunderstood outsider is embodied by Kirk Douglas in Vincent Minnelli's 1956 film, A Lust for Life. This is a poster for the film. And I didn't know whether to include the next ones, but I did. And Van Gogh has become a kind of iconic figure within popular culture. So, here you can see a group of bobblehead figurines with Van Gogh alongside other iconic figures of popular culture, Warhol, Dali, and Picasso. I Googled Warhol and toys, and Van Gogh and toys rather, and there's a whole series of images which I could have shown, but this is just one example. The continuing interest in Van Gogh's work is also evident in the furore that surrounded the recent discovery of a previously unknown painting by the artist, Sunset at Montmajour. Here it's being presented to the press by the Van Gogh Museum director, Axel Ruger. This is a painting from 1888, from the Arles period. It was a strong painting, and as I say, it's created a lot of interest. Although the presentation of this work has been kind of satirized in the press, this is in regard to this image and I guess Van Gogh's perceived inability to sell any work in his lifetime. It's often said that he only ever sold one painting in his career, but in fact the reality was more complex. I wrote about that was the essay that Anne mentioned when I sort of delved into Van Gogh's career in terms of his markets and his thinking about his art in terms of commodities. And he actually sold not one painting but 4 paintings in his career, and he understood the workings of the art market actually really well. I mean, he spent several years as an art dealer in London, Paris, and Amsterdam in the 1870s. One of the interesting things about Van Gogh is that he only turned to painting pretty late on in his career, when he was 27. So his output is limited to the last 10 years of his life, between the age of 27 and 37. But within that 10-year period, he was incredibly prolific. He produced 900 paintings and around 1,000 drawings, as well as a voluminous body of correspondence written in several languages, most notably Dutch, French, and English. He obviously was fluent in Dutch, but also French and English. And if you get a chance, I do recommend you're looking at those letters. They're incredibly rich, and you really get a sense of Van Gogh as this deeply cultured man. So this talk is going to focus on his relationship to Japanese culture. As we know, Japan had opened up to the West in the mid-1850s, and there was a particularly notable display of Japanese art at the 1867 World's Fair in Paris. Here I'm showing you an image of the 1867 Japanese pavilion. And then just a little bit of context, because the exhibition here does look at Impressionism looking east, but there were Barbizon School artists who were looking east earlier. Probably the first artist to be influenced by a Japanese prince was Teodoro Rousseau, the Barbizon School painter, probably the leader of the Barbizon School, who's known to have repainted actually the sky of this painting, the village of Becquigny, in the early 1860s under the influence of Japanese prints. And then another Barbizon School artist, Jean-François Millet, who was also fascinated by Japanese prints, their compositional strategies, their bright, flat colors, their high horizons, And this work here by Millet in the Auvergne from the late 60s, I think, with its high horizon line, taps into that interest in Japanese prints. Other younger artists from the Impressionist generation, as we know, just a little bit more context before I speak more about Van Gogh, also produced work relating to the vogue for Japanisme. This is James Tissot, close friend of Degas, young women looking at Japanese objects. And this is a famous work by Monet showing his wife Camille, who's dressed in a kimono and sort of with a background of fans, she's holding a fan. This was shown at the Second Impressionist exhibition in 1876. But I want to argue here that actually no other avant-garde artist of the mid to late 19th century engaged with Japanese art in as profound and wholehearted a way as Vincent van Gogh. Van Gogh first mentions Japanese art in his letters when he was in Antwerp in Belgium in November 1885, noting that he had hung Japanese prints in his room at that time and read the work of the Goncourt brothers, who were celebrating Japanese art in their books in the 1860s and 1870s. Van Gogh then came to Paris in 1886 and became a regular visitor to the gallery of the noted art dealer Siegfried Bing, who's represented here in a kimono. Bing was one of the most prominent figures in terms of the art market in promoting Japanese art in Paris in the 1880s. This is his gallery, which is, as you can see, is decorated in a kind of Japanese style. And Van Gogh himself actually organized an exhibition of Japanese prints soon after he arrived in Paris. He was in Paris from 86 to 88, but in 1887, he organized a show of Japanese prints and paintings at the cafe belonging to this woman, Agostina Segatori. She was an Italian, owned a cafe called Le Temperin. And you can see in the background of this image one of the paintings that was in the exhibition. This is probably a Japanese scroll painting. And then perhaps most notably, when Van Gogh was in Paris, he began to develop a collection of Japanese prints with his brother Theo. And the Van Gogh Museum now actually has a collection of 474 prints, which were inherited from Vincent and Theo. Some were added by Theo's son, but the majority did come from Vincent and Theo, and it's generally agreed that the two brothers had around 400 prints in their collection. In 1887, Van Gogh produced 3 painted copies after his Japanese prints, 3 of the prints in his collection. And this one, as we know, the Hiroshige print on the right is in the exhibition. And you can see the Van Gogh copy on the left. You can see this is the motif with the figures crossing the bridge and protecting themselves with umbrellas. I think this is a figure actually with a straw raincoat, and then a figure here sort of poling down the river. And Van Gogh's copy is pretty, is pretty close to the original, but he does really intensify the color. That's something very characteristic of his copies, as well as adding these inscriptions around the edge. The borders, I'll talk a little bit more in the context of the other copies that he produces. Then this is a second copy that he produces in Paris after the Ezen courtesan print, which is also in the exhibition. So this is Van Gogh's copy. The copy wasn't actually made after the print itself, but instead after a reproduction of the print, which was on the cover of a magazine called Paris Illustré. So this is the magazine cover from 1886. Van Gogh made a tracing of it. He traced the cover, added a grid, and then actually enlarged the original print. So this image here is considerably larger than the original cover. And you can see, interestingly, he's added this border, and so you can see the bamboo along the edge here. There's a cute little frog in the foreground here. There's a couple in a boat up here, water lilies here, and then a couple of cranes here, which are actually excerpted from other Japanese prints. But He included these, the frog and the crane, for a particular reason, because in French slang, both of these elements actually reference prostitution, and he was, tapping into the history of the courtesan as referencing that history of prostitution in Japan. And then this is the third copy that he produced, and again, this is great that all these prints are in this exhibition. So this is the Hiroshige print, the plum tree tea house at Kamedo, and again, he made a tracing of this print, added the grid around the tracing, and enlarged it. You can see in this work, I think he was interested in the kind of disjunction between near and far. The way in the original print you have this, this wonderful kind of silhouette of this gnarled plum tree, flowering plum tree, and then in the distance, this group of figures who are congregating around the tea house and enjoying the blossom of the plum trees. So that this kind of play between near and far is something that Van Gogh really taps into in his own painting. And again, you can see the intensification of the color in his print, and the addition of elements around the border. This idea of playing with near and far does continue into several of his images in the late 1880s. This is a famous work called The Sower. And you can see the same idea with the silhouetted tree in the foreground, and then this is a church in the distance. And then Van Gogh also painted a portrait of his dealer, Père Tanguy, surrounded by prints, which actually belonged to Van Gogh. Tanguy is a fascinating figure. He was, Van Gogh didn't have many dealers in Paris in the 1880s, but Tanguy was extremely supportive of him, and regularly showed Van Gogh's work in his gallery. Tanguy was a socialist utopian. He'd been part of the Paris Commune in 1871. That sort of fascinating moment in French history is often sort of overlooked. But he'd been sent into exile in the wake of the Commune, but had returned to France in 1873. And Tanguy's sympathy for the common man, I think, is suggested in the way that Van Gogh dresses him here with this sort of working man's jacket in particular. And I think that Van Gogh associated Tanguy's idealism with Japan and the idealism of Japanese artists, in contrast to the kind of competitive urban environment which he experienced in Paris. So he represents Tanguy here against a range of Japanese prints, and they really kind of sum up the artist's or Van Gogh's attitude to Japan. You see a range of landscape. You can see Mount Fuji up here, and a number of two geishas here. This is actually the courtesan painting. This is probably Van Gogh's own copy, which I just showed you. The others are actually Japanese prints, I think. And you can actually identify the print. So that's what I'll try and do now. This is two of the prints. This is a Hiroshige cherry tree, which you can see up here. These are two figures who are planting rice in the fields. And this one here is this is a print of the courtesan Takao of the Mirai, if I can say it, with irises behind her, which is reproduced here. And then these two are slightly more speculative, but the view of Mount Fuji here may be derived from this print by Hiroshige, where you can see the similar kind of reeds in the foreground, which you see to either side. I mean, there's some kind of artistic license here, I think. And then to this side, you have the Morning Glories, which are derived, I think, from this Japanese print to the right. And then the last one was kind of the hardest one to track down. But this view of snow here is, again, it's not a direct reproduction of a print, but it probably derives from this, again, a Hiroshige print, a snow scene. So what you're seeing here is, actually Van Gogh representing the four seasons. You have the cherry blossom, which is spring, and the morning glory, which is summer, Mount Fuji here, which is autumn, and then the snow scene here, which is winter. So representing the range of the seasons which Japanese print artists were representing, and really kind of summing up in one image with the geisha, also the sort of principal themes within Japanese print imagery. Oh, I don't know why I put this one in, but this is again, to try and liven things up a bit, include a caricature, and this is actually a caricature based on Per Tongi, and Van Gogh is presenting his Per Tongi painting to a Parisian dealer, and talking about Japanese influences, Impressionism and Pointillism, asking for the dealer's opinion of his work, and the dealer has been extremely complimentary, as you can see, saying that you paint like a lunatic. So, kind of tapping into that mythology again of Van Gogh as being a sort of crazy outsider figure. But in fact, we know, his mental problems were particularly epileptic, and there were particular moments particular periods where he wasn't painting, but for the periods when he was painting and when he was drawing, he was actually very lucid and methodical in his methods. I mean, just look at the tracings that I've just been showing you, for example. So a really crucial period in Van Gogh's career in terms of understanding his relationship to Japan is his time in Arles in the south of France. He was in Arles for around a year between 1888 and 1889. Arles, as you know, is an ancient Roman city. And Van Gogh was, I think he was becoming increasingly disillusioned with the world of Paris and the sort of cutthroat, sort of capitalistic environment which he was experiencing there. And he decided to move to the south of France in February 1888. And through the reading of various writers, the Goncourt brothers, Philippe Berti, visits to Siegfried Bing's gallery, he really developed this vision of the south of France as akin to Japan, as a place of light and luminosity, which he associated with Japan. When he arrived in February 1888, he actually encountered snow. He didn't encounter the sort of bright light and sun that he'd been expecting, but he immediately compared what he saw to a Japanese print. And it's fascinating to read his letters from this time. Very few letters by Van Gogh survive from his time in Paris. But once he gets down to Arles and he's writing back to Théo in Paris, you see a really voluminous correspondence. And his letters are full of references to to Japan rather. Around 100 letters refer to Japan over the period of his career, and most of those are written during the Arles period. He talks about how he finds, quote, equivalents, unquote, to Japan in the South. His letters are great. I mean, I'm just going to quote one here. The weather here remains fine, and if it was always like this, it will be better than a painter's paradise. It will be absolute Japan. And this is a painting from soon after he arrived in Arles, with the kind of high viewpoint, the contorted tree form, the very kind of, it's a very sort of Japanese effect, the way that, the scene is represented here. And then this painting was produced a couple of months after he'd arrived in Arles. And again, his correspondence specifically talks about this work. He describes it as, quote, this is a view of Arles, a little town surrounded by fields, all covered with yellow and purple flowers exactly. Can't you see it? Like a Japanese dream. Now, several of his works from this time focus on landscape and nature. And I love this. He wrote of his time in Provence. Again, this is a quote from his letters. Here, I'll have more and more the existence of a Japanese painter living close to nature. So I think it's a key point that he appreciated Japanese art on a formal level. You can see the bright, the flat color, the bright color, which is characteristic of his work at this time, and I think it is influenced by Japanese prints. You can see the high horizons. In several of his paintings from this time, the dramatic cropping effects, which are very characteristic of Japanese prints. So there's influence on a formal level, but in a way, at least for me, sort of more interesting is the way that he engages with Japanese art on a spiritual level, sort of metaphysical level. He developed a profound attraction to what he perceived as the humility, the simplicity, the closeness to nature of the Japanese way of life, which he saw as a counterpoint to the corruption and decadence of what he found in Paris in particular, the urban environment. I'll talk about that a little bit more later on. This is another work that he produced, fairly soon after arriving in Arles, and he talked about this as being inspired by a sunset effect that he'd seen on the River Rhone. He compared it again to Japan. Quote, "I saw a magnificent and strange effect this evening. A very big boat loaded with coal on the Rhone, moored to the quay, the sky lilac with an orange streak in the west. It was pure hokusai." So you can see he's seeing nature here through the lens of Japanese art. Now, interestingly, hokusai is the one Japanese artist you would have expected to be in Van Gogh's collection of Japanese prints who actually wasn't in his collection. And the reason was that by this point, hokusai was too expensive for Van Gogh. Hokusai was the best-known Japanese printmaker by the late 19th century. Most of Van Gogh's prints are actually lesser-known Japanese printmakers. Hiroshige is the most prominent figure within his collection. He noted proudly at one point that some of his prints would be worth, quote, as much as 5 francs, which is not a great deal. So I've looked a little bit at landscape, and I also want to talk a little bit now about portraiture. Portraiture was also central to Van Gogh's output at Arles. He produced about 25 portraits in particular of the Roulin family, and it's so great that you have this painting in the exhibition. I've just seen an exhibition at the Cleveland Museum of Art called Van Gogh Repetitions, which brings together a series of portraits of Joseph Roulin. There were 6 portraits that Van Gogh did of Roulin. They would have loved to have this painting in their exhibition, so you did a good job getting it here. But they do have four paintings of Joseph Roulin, but this is actually the first of the 6, and it's the only one which is three-quarter length. This is a postman, Joseph Roulin. He was responsible for unloading mail at the Arles train station. He was one of Van Gogh's closest friends and a drinking companion for Van Gogh. Van Gogh, I keep saying Van Gogh, it's bizarre for me to say Van Gogh, I should say, because I'm from England and we all say Van Gogh out there, or Van Gogh, but I've become Americanized, I say Van Gogh now. But anyway, Van Gogh first mentions Roulin on the 31st of July, 1888, and he says about him, quote, "The man is a fervent Republican and socialist, reasons very well and knows many things." And then Van Gogh went on to describe his three-quarter length portrait of Roulin sitting in a chair, the work which is in your exhibition. And he says, "I'm now working on the portrait of a postman with his dark blue uniform with yellow, a head something like that of Socrates, almost no nose, a high forehead, bald pate," that's probably why he wore a hat. Oh, well, it's for his job as well, but anyway. "Small grey eyes, high-coloured, full cheeks, and big beard, pepper and salt, big ears. His wife gave birth today, and so he's really in fine feather and glowing with satisfaction." So this is a background to the painting in your exhibition. And it's interesting just to look at it, the way it is painted. It's very thinly painted in the background. It's interesting to see the pentimenti here. You can see the way that he's changed the line of the sleeve of Roulin. I hadn't really realized that until I actually looked at the painting. You can see that originally the sleeve was wider. He took it in a little bit. And also the hat, he slightly changed the line of the hats. The hands are fascinating because the right hand is pretty sketchily painted, but the left hand is a little bit more developed, and you see these, the outlining in red, or the fingers here, which you don't see on the right hand. And then the beard and the face itself is fascinating. The way that Van Gogh is playing with the complementaries. The nostrils have touches of red in them, and then the yellow in the beard, and then the blue in the hat. The way he plays those red, yellows, and blues off against each other, I think is really fascinating. And this is, it's interesting to see the actor portraits, the Japanese actor portraits in the show. And this is, I put this one in a 3/4 length portrait, which you can argue may have influenced Van Gogh. And then, an interesting thing, which is discussed a little bit in that repetition show, is that Van Gogh did produce these drawings after the painting, and two variant drawings. This is one which he actually sent to his painter colleague Émile Bernard. It's sort of complicating this idea of Van Gogh as a sort of sort of tormented outsider figure. He was quite calculating in his methods, the way he did produce repetitions. So he'll produce these repetitions to send to his artist friends in the hope of developing collaborations with them. And this is the second drawing repetition, where if you look carefully, I don't know if you can see the difference. Can you see the difference in this one compared to that one? No? So he adds this, he adds the glass on the right, and I don't know why he did that exactly, but Roulin had this reputation as a hard drinker, so there may have been a reference to that. And then he also produced 5 other views of Roulin, and these are all close-up bust views, and they're fascinating. This one was produced at the same time as the work in the exhibition, when he was getting frustrated with Roulin's kind of pose, which he felt was too static, so he painted this work very quickly. And then another drawing, and this is a fascinating one. I mean, this is so abstract, and this is painted at the same time so he was working with Gauguin in Arles. Gauguin came to visit Van Gogh for 2 months between October and December 1888, and I'll talk a little bit more about what actually happened ultimately with that visit. But this is Van Gogh in some ways being far more abstract than what we've seen before, with this very flat background, which you could argue is Japanese. And the ear here is great. It's just this line of red. But it's very flat and very abstract, this painting, and perhaps was produced under the influence of Gauguin. And you can argue the relationship to Japanese prints here. This is the next one. This is at the Barnes collection, and by now Van Gogh is producing these Roulin portraits with this very decorative wallpaper background of dahlias. This is actually rarely that he doesn't generally sign his work, but in this case he does. And then these last two, I think it's interesting to see the progression, because the way he treats a beard, for example, becomes increasingly decorative. And you can see the sort of play of the swirling lines that are less evident in the earlier portraits. Another thing to think about in Van Gogh's work is that his paintings change with time, and we know that this painting originally, these little dots of colour here, they were once red and pink, but they've changed with time, they've faded, and they've actually turned to white. The Van Gogh Museum has done a lot of work on these kind of transformations. And I include this, the famous Starry Night, because the way that the sky is represented here, I think you can compare to the beard in these images here. Another one of my caricatures. So this is Starry, Starry Night, and so lesson known Prozac period, sunny, sunny day, and again, the reference to Van Gogh's mood swings, or perceived mood swings. This one is interesting. This is La Mousme, there should be an accent there. And this is a portrait, I think, directly related to Japanese culture. It was produced around the same time as the Roulin portraits we were just looking at. And musme, the word musme, as he noted, was a Japanese word, as Van Gogh noted, was a Japanese word for a young girl. And he noted in his letters that she would have been 12 to 14 years old. And here he's painted a Provençal girl, but represented her as a kind of Japanese. And he talks about the musme idea as referencing particularly the idea of pouting, mu in French. So you can see she does have a slight pout. And the word was actually much used by the French writer Pierre Loti in his book Madame Chrysanthème. So, and that was interesting to see that in the exhibition, the kimono, with the chrysanthemum pattern. The Madame Chrysanthème was a book which Van Gogh read and repeatedly quoted in his letters, and it's this fascinating history of a Western naval officer and a Japanese geisha, and as we know, became the model for Madame Butterfly. And then, some of Van Gogh's drawings. Van Gogh, incredibly prolific draftsman, and his style of drawing is certainly influenced by Japanese art and the Japanese method of drawing. His kind of formal language of squiggles and varying lines and dots in the sky. I mean, this is exactly the kind of thing that you find in the Japanese drawing of artists like Hokusai. This is another one. I'll show you a drawing by Hokusai in a second, but this is a work which Van Gogh was proud of, and I think he said, this is my most Japanese work to date. And it's a view of the La Croix from Montmajour, and you can see again these little dots in the drawing. The high horizon, which is very Japanese. You can see the train crossing the plain here, the carriage here, sort of interesting mix of the modern and the less modern. And then interestingly, if you look carefully at the bottom here, the cartouche which he's included, which describes the subject, the title of the painting, I think that's derived from Japanese prints. It's exactly the same kind of cartouche that you see in the Hiroshige prints or the other Japanese artists in the exhibition. And then this is a detail of a Hokusai print where you can see that similar sort of use of dotted work that we find in the Van Gogh drawings. So at the same time that Van Gogh was producing these drawings, I think he really aimed to create what he called a studio of the South, a collaborative community of artists working together in harmony on the model of a Japanese monastery. He envisaged a life together at the Yellow House in Arles with his fellow painters, Paul Gauguin and Émile Bernard. And he encouraged the exchange of portraits with Gauguin and Bernard to cement their bond. And this he saw as being a model which Japanese artists had actually created. He talked about Japanese artists as exchanging work between themselves. This is the Yellow House where Van Gogh lived and where Gauguin lived with him for those 2 months in the late period of 1888. So these are the two portraits which Gauguin and Bernard sent to Van Gogh. And this is Gauguin's on the left. This is a portrait of Bernard actually at the back. And if you look carefully here, you can see this inscription. It says Les Misérables, l'ami Vincent, P. Gauguin, 1888. And this is actually Gauguin sort of cultivating his sort of outsider mentality and sort of referencing the difficulties and troubles he's had, and referencing specifically the Victor Hugo novel Les Misérables here. And in a letter, when he talks about this painting, he actually describes himself as Jean Valjean, who was a protagonist of Les Misérables. And then this is Bernard. This is his portrait, which was sent to Van Gogh. So you can see Bernard's signature à son copain Vincent, to his friend Vincent. This is Gauguin in the background, and here there's a reference of Bernard's interest in Japanese prints, because there's a Japanese print at the bottom right here. And then this is the image I started with, the one where I talked about Van Gogh describing himself as quote, worshipping the eternal Buddha, the way he was, I think, trying to engage with the more sort of metaphysical aspects of Japanese culture. It's almost as if he's kind of effacing his Dutch identity here to become Japanese. If you look carefully, there's a sort of aureole around the head of Van Gogh, which is almost like the sort of aureole that you find around the Bodhisattva. And then if you look even more carefully, you can see that there's an inscription up the top here. This was originally inscribed to Paul Gauguin. This was Van Gogh's own inscription to Paul Gauguin. Let's bear that in mind because I'll come back to that. But Van Gogh's painting was based on the shaved heads of Japanese monks, which he'd seen in the illustrated book of Pierre Loti's Madame Chrysanthème. So you can see here these Japanese monks here, which I think inspired Van Gogh to shave his own head, and even their costume here with the V-neck is something that I think influences Van Gogh's costume here. Now, Gauguin had arrived in Arles in October 1888. He spent 2 months there, and there was an intense collaboration between the two artists, but as is well known, it led to a celebrated fight between them when Van Gogh pulled a razor on Gauguin, and Gauguin went back to Paris pretty quickly, and Van Gogh cut off his ear. And in the wake of that, what we generally think is that Van Gogh scrubbed out the inscription that he made to Gauguin. That dramatic falling out with Gauguin kind of signaled the end of this great idealism he'd had for the creation of a community of artists at Arles, that community of artists based on the Japanese model. And then, in the wake of cutting off his ear, he produced this portrait with a bandaged ear in January 1889. This is a work in the Courtauld collection. The idea of Van Gogh cutting off his ear, which was an incredibly traumatic time for him, has become the subject of much popular culture. To digress in some ways here, the ways in which his story has been appropriated for popular culture, here is a bandaged action figure of Vincent van Gogh. I like this one. This is Van Gogh, a recurring problem in later years with his unable to keep his glasses on. And then my favorite is this one, the disappearing Vincent van Gogh mug, where you put your hot beverage in the mug and Van Gogh's ear disappears. I'm sure Van Gogh would have loved that. Anyway. For our purposes, what we can see if you look carefully in the background of this portrait is a Japanese print. And we can identify the print. So this is a print on the right where you can see the geisha. You can see Mount Fuji in the background, and it's pretty accurately represented by Van Gogh. There's some playing around with the placing of the figures, and actually, do you remember I said that in the copy after the Essen portrait of the courtesan that he'd added 2 cranes in the border? Do you remember that? Well, those 2 cranes were actually excerpted from this print here. Now, after the episode of Van Gogh cutting off his ear and the rupture with Gauguin, Van Gogh rarely actually refers to Japan or Japanese art in his letters. Really, the high point of the references to Japan is the Arles period, and in the early months of 1889, he moves to Saint-Rémy and spends time in the asylum at Saint-Rémy. But the influence of Japanese art continues, particularly in his focus on close-up details. And I think his attraction to the way that Japanese artists focused on particular elements in nature he was influenced by by his reading, and particularly by the kind of images that he saw in Siegfried Bing's publication Le Japon Artistique, Artistic Japan. And this is the cover illustration and title page of Le Japon Artistique, with the reference to Bing, who we saw, if you remember at the beginning, in that photograph of him. He was a prominent dealer in Japanism and Japanese prints, but also produced publications to promote Japanism. And this was the most prominent of those. And this publication had these great images, and this is from the opening publication in May 1888, with these great details. This is a study of pinks, this is a study of grasses, and these are we know that Van Gogh read this publication, and I think they really informed his work. And this is quite a long quote, but it is worth quoting, because I think it's quite insightful in terms of his understanding of Japanese art. He said, this is in 1888, "If we study Japanese art, then we see an undoubtedly wise and philosophic and intelligent man. He studies a single blade of grass. But this blade of grass leads him to draw all the plants, then the seasons, then broad features of landscapes, finally animals, and then the human figure. Isn't it almost a new religion that these Japanese teach us, who are so simple and live in nature as if they themselves were flowers?" So I think he loved the way that in Japanese art there was this really close focus on the detail and the particular elements within the landscape. And I think that aesthetic informs his late focus on close-up details in his own painting. A wonderful group of works that he produced at Saint-Rémy in the final year, the final February 1889 to May 1890 at Saint-Rémy. This is the Getty painting Irises, where you can see that sort of close-up element that I think he did take from Japanese prints. This is a beautiful painting, Emperor Moth. And this is a famous painting, Almond Tree and Blossom. This is actually, this has an interesting history, because it was produced at the time of the birth of his nephew, Vincent Wilhelm, so that the son of his brother Theo. And Van Gogh sent it to Paris, to Theo, where the proud parents actually hung the work in the bedroom of their newborn child. But I think, this work pretty evidently, draws on Japanese prints. And then, this final work, which was produced when he was in Auvers, this is called Roots and Tree Trunks. And this is often said to be Van Gogh's final painting. There's some debate over that as to which was the final work, but this now the debate is going in this direction. And again, this is sort of close-up, focus on particular elements within the landscape. So we can literally say, I think, that the Japanese aesthetic remained with Van Gogh until the end of his life. So this is the image with which I started the lecture, which I think embodies the artist's vision, in his words, of quote, a Japanese painter or a Japanese painter living close to nature, unquote. So just as a coda, I'm going to show this image. So in the wake of his death, Van Gogh's influence has continued. He of course has a great impact in Japan. His work has been much bought in Japan by Japanese collectors and exhibited in Japanese museums. What you see here is actually the banner for a 2013 Van Gogh exhibition in a Paris show at Hiroshima. And in China and Japan, you see these factories of people actually producing large numbers of hand-painted reproductions of Van Gogh paintings. It's more so in China, actually, but it does overlap to Japan. And this is one of the shops in which these paintings are sold. So this is based on the Red Vineyard. This is actually used to be thought that this was the only painting that Van Gogh ever sold. It's in the Pushkin Museum. This is a copy after it. This is a famous Van Gogh sunflowers. So Van Gogh's influence remains very strong until this day in Japan. So thank you. Are there any questions? Happy to take questions. Yeah.
Early on when you showed I think it was the cherry blossoms, I remembered the Van Gogh show I saw at Philadelphia. It reminded me, I'm glad you showed the almond tree
Yeah.
blossoms. That slide doesn't do justice to it.
Speak to my assistant. Yeah.
It's absolutely beautiful.
Yeah. No, I agree. Yeah. Although that was better than the one we had before.
Yeah,
So-
it's just, I mean, you can't imagine until you see it.
Yeah.
The real, just the power of that painting. But in just bringing up the whole thing, I think you kind of even took the Japanese religious kind of spiritual
Yeah.
tradition of looking at the simple plants to even its next level of like showing the dandelion and all the really humble, simple plants in all this, like you were saying, this immense detail,
Yeah.
real close up, and just really fascinating.
I think that's a great point, and I think it is fascinating that that level of detail. What it makes me think of as well is Blake, seeing the world in a grain of sand. That idea of just really seeing so much in so little. But to me it is. I love the formal aspects, the way that Van Gogh does crop his forms, and the flattening of form, the coloristic influence. But I think that is probably what separates him from Monet, to me, that he engages with Japanese art on a more kind of spiritual, metaphysical level than Monet does. At least that's what I think. I mean, I've done quite a bit of work on Monet, and Monet did have a big collection of Japanese prints, but you don't get that sense of kind of intensity, the way that he engaged with Japan that Van Gogh had. And I think, it taps into Van Gogh's background. He had this spiritual background. His father was a pastor. He himself spent several years as a preacher. And you read it, when you read his letters, they have this very strong, metaphysical, content to them, which you don't generally find in Monet's letters. So he gave that sort of gloss to the way that he looked at Japanese art. Yeah.
He's such a great painter when it comes to backgrounds. Why do you think in some of those that he chose not to dilute the background, not have the background at all? Is that because he's trying to focus on the full focus on the figure?
That's a good question. I mean, can you hear the questions? Did you hear the question? So the question was, why does Van Gogh kind of simplify his backgrounds, and is that right? Sort of it doesn't have much detail in the background. That's basically what you're saying. Yeah.
One, he's great at detail.
Yeah.
But when he's chosen in several of the paintings you've shown tonight to I don't know if the prints took it from the Japanese prints, but why he would dilute the background when he's so good at background on some of them, and then it seems like he does these great landscapes,
Mm-hmm.
and he doesn't mesh the two together.
Well, I could look at some examples, but I think it may be getting back to the Japanese influence. I mean, what you see in a lot of Japanese prints are those the lack of detail in the background, sort of flat backgrounds, and the kind of thing that you see in the Hiroshige print of the plum tree at Komedo, where you see that contrast between foreground and background, and that real kind of disjunction of near and far. I mean, I think he was interested in that kind of spatial disjunction, and you could argue that that's enhanced by keeping the background really simple. And you see that in the Van Gogh that you have in your exhibition, that the background is very simple, and it has this kind of sort of patchwork, but it makes the figure really pop, exactly. And I mean, I could have shown other. There's a great painting in the Metropolitan La Lysienne, which has this kind of bright lemon yellow background, which is just lemon yellow. And it's like that's a beautiful painting from the Winterthur collection of Roulin with the yellow background that I showed. Just really simple, but it really makes makes the subject pop. And one of the differences between Van Gogh and Gauguin is that I think you can say that while Gauguin was genuinely moving towards abstraction, Van Gogh's work is always grounded in nature, I would say. But in those works, that's the closest he gets to abstraction, that moment when he is working with Gauguin.
I just think it's so, the thing that I think is so interesting is, starting
Yeah. Well, yeah, started back to another issue because, in his, Van Gogh has this moment in 1889 where he starts to explore what he calls style. Theo is always urging him to produce more naturalistic work because that sells better. He thinks it will sell better. But Van Gogh's trying to push himself, go in new directions, so he's developing this, much more decorative style. So that's, you see all the, the curling patterns in the sky. Theo didn't want him to do that. Theo's like, why are you doing this? This is bad. So Van Gogh does continue that for a brief moment, but actually he goes back to a greater sense of naturalism, in the late period of 1889. So it's interesting that back and forth between Vincent and Theo is fascinating, because Theo is trying to make him produce work which will sell better. So.
I think he was influenced by fabric. That textile industry also really takes on that world.
Oh, that's a really interesting point. Yeah, I think that's one of the great things about the exhibition is the sort of range of media that you have in it. I think I said that at the beginning, to see the kimonos, and I think that's a good point. I think he was. I think he was. He wasn't just looking at prints. I'm sure. He would have. Seen that kind of. The kind of costumes that you have in the exhibition. He would have seen that at Bing's. Or would have seen. At the World's Fair when. When he would have seen women dressed up as in kimonos or whatever. So I think that's certainly a valid comparison.
Was the Buddhist religion much in evidence in Northern Europe?
It's a good question. You do. I don't know all the details of that. But what I can say is that generally you don't find much interest in it in the middle to the. Sort of when positivism is a sort of dominant paradigm with people like Renoir and Auguste Comte, you don't see so much interest. But in the later part of the 19th century, with the rise of symbolism and a greater interest in comparative religion, I do think you start to see more interest in Buddhism, and several of the artists who were working in the symbolist mode were looking to Buddhism. Probably the best example is Audran Redon, and he does some great paintings which actually depict the Buddha, and could be a good comparison for Van Gogh. So I think that at the end of the century there is more interest in Buddhism. Yeah.
I'm a little confused, like in the little pear tree and in the sowers. So the tree trunk, the influence that we're referring to, are we saying the tree wasn't there, or are we saying that the obviously the Japanese influence, but for the little pear tree, does not the little pear tree in France, in southern France, look the same as the little pear tree in Japan? That he's looking at that pear tree. So it's actually an application of what he visualizes, as much of it is a technique of influence in that particular case. What's your opinion?
Well, there was a pear tree. This is one of a whole series that he did of orchards in the south of France. There are various other views of apple orchards. So it's grounded in nature. There is an essential naturalism to that image. But he sees nature through the lens of Japanese art. I think that's the way to look at it. So you can look at the way that he pictures the pear blossom, the pear tree as being influenced by his knowledge of Japanese prints, and the sort of flattening effect and the kind of abstracting sort of decorative effect that he creates is informed by exactly those kind of effects that he saw in Japanese prints. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. And then when you're looking at a field outside of Arles, even today, the colors and everything that's in the painting is still there today. That as far as the technique versus actually painting what is in front of him, I have a little trouble assimilating that he's not actually painting what he sees.
Well, he's not. It's not photographic, is it? It's not. So he's. But that's part of what. If he was to.
He painted fast.
Yeah.
Was looking at it as he
Yeah. Yeah, but that's, the whole history of, avant-garde modernism is sort of, from Manet through to Jackson Pollock or whatever. It's a whole story of getting away from photographic naturalism. That's a story of, avant-garde, avant-garde painting and experimenting with the paint surface ultimately as a two-dimensional, surface which becomes abstract, and moving away from the idea of a painting as being like a three-dimensional window through space. And Van Gogh is on the cusp with that sort of change towards abstraction, because, as I said, I do think that his work is grounded in nature, but there's certainly an interest in intensified color, flattening effects, movement, other things too I'm forgetting, I'm sure. Yeah.
Just keying in on that lack of commercial success.
Yeah.
I wasn't aware before your talk that you did have a nuanced understanding of the market.
Yeah.
And all these other things.
Yeah.
Failed so abysmally in spite of that from a sales standpoint.
Yeah.
You touched on a minute ago that his brother was pushing and he needed
Yeah.
perhaps look at things or approach things more naturalistically, more photographically, however you want to put it. Do you think he was just sort of ahead in the curve with respect to that?
I mean, in a way, he's. I mean, the relationship between the artist and the market is always an interesting one, and Van Gogh had a very strong sense of his own identity, and I don't think wanted to adapt necessarily to the, to what the market wanted. But when I did that, I did quite a bit of work, and he was involved with several dealers, and he did sell a few works, and and he was selling, he was showing paintings in several exhibitions in Paris and in Belgium, and starting to get pretty good critical reviews. He got this wonderful, quite a famous review by a critic called Albert Aurier in early 1890, which was a glowing review. He was starting to get better known, and he just had a painting bought by a Belgian painter called Anna Bock for 400 francs, a Red Vineyard in early 1890s. So I think, had he not committed suicide, he, within 2 or 3 years, he would have been enjoying actually some success. He was starting to become better known when he actually killed himself. So, any other questions? Good questions. It's great. So,
Thank you.
all right. Thank you. Yeah. Thank you.